Hello my friends, in today's video we will take a look at the cameras on iPhone 13 Pro. Apple has been continuously upgrading cameras on the iPhones basically since the first iPhone. They have done so in many different ways, but if you really want to improve camera performance, the most effective way to do that is to increase the sensor size and the optical quality of the lens. That is what Apple did with iPhone 13 Pro, so in this video we will take a look at the performance and the feature set of 13 Pro's camera setup to find out how good it really is. First of all, I greatly appreciate that we don't need to get the max version to get the best camera setup available. Both 6.1-inch and 6.7-inch iPhones finally have the same camera setup. The upgrades that I have mentioned can be seen even on the outside of the iPhone 13 Pro. The days of iPhones with flat cameras are long gone. I'm not complaining though. At least on the paper, it is more than worth living with that camera bump in exchange for the camera hardware upgrades. On the Pro version, we have the ultra-wide 13mm lens, wide 26mm lens, and telephoto 77mm, which is actually a real short telephoto lens this time. All three cameras still use 12-megapixel Sony sensor, and I still think that it is the right decision. It has various advantages that I will explain during this video. The main camera uses a 1/1.65-inch type sensor paired with a 26mm equivalent f1.5 lens. That is a very big sensor by smartphone standards. It is slightly larger than the 1/1.7-inch sensor in DJI Pocket 2 for example. It is also larger than the 1/1.9-inch sensor in iPhone 12 Pro Max. Pretty large sensor combined with a relatively low resolution means that a sensor has lower pixel density. That means that it basically scans the lens less precisely and it won't pick up the optical imperfections so easily. The amount of detail is really good by smartphone standards. That really brings the iPhone 13 Pro a lot closer to dedicated cameras. The improvements in the low light are also massive. That larger sensor can naturally capture more light, which means that there is again more detail and less noise even in the low light situations. It can also still use the night mode, which usually uses shorter exposures, and the overall result is a lot better in comparison to 12 Pro. Ultra-wide camera still uses 1/3.4-inch sensor, but the lens is new. It has f1.8 aperture and it also seems to be a lot better optically. Ultra-wide lens on the iPhone used to be all about the dramatic 13mm field of view without much emphasis on the image quality. Now it actually captures a very decent amount of detail. Distortion correction is also perfect. I can say that I like the images shot with ultra-wide camera a lot. The new lens also lets in almost twice as much light in comparison to 12 Pro, which means that it produces dramatically better images in the low light. The telephoto camera also uses 1/3.4-inch sensor, but the f2.8 lens is actually darker than the f2 lens on the 12 Pro. The focal range has also changed from 52 to 77mm. I will say right away that I think that this is a downgrade. 77mm is a dedicated portrait focal length, so if you take a lot of portraits you may like it, but the 52mm lens on 12 Pro was a lot more versatile. f2.8 lens also lets in only half the light in comparison to f2, so the performance is not great in less than ideal light conditions. The image quality is in my opinion the weakest out of the three cameras, unless you shoot RAWs, as I will explain in a minute. It still increases the versatility of the triple camera setup, so it is definitely nice to have any telephoto lens at all. On the other hand, the Pro RAW files are incredible. It basically puts together multiple images with different exposures to preserve the detail in both highlights and shadows. And that absolutely works. When you combine that with a naturally good dynamic range of the main sensor, the results are fantastic. You can push the files as far as you want to without seeing any noise at all. The amount of detail that you can recover from the highlights is just as impressive. Apple has implemented the stacked RAW feature perfectly. I actually think that this is one of the most significant strengths of the iPhone 13 Pro that can help it to be a more relevant traditional camera competitor than ever, but that is a story for another time. ProRAW fortunately works on all three cameras, and it is equally impressive. Another very important advantage of the RAW shooting is that you can completely avoid the over-sharpening. As I mentioned, it makes the biggest difference with the telephoto shots. If you use RAWs, it is a night and day difference, and I can actually say that I like RAWs shot with a telephoto camera. I can't really say that about the HEIC. The colors are still saturated and vibrant, but considering that it is still a smartphone, it is not an overkill. A big improvement are the colors in cloudy or overcast weather. It won't make everything super warm, green, and dramatic anymore. It will still try to recover highlights, but the white balance is set correctly. Regarding the video, that continues to be a major strength of iPhones. Again, the processing is just great. Just like with the stills, the amount of detail is very good, the colors are very nice, and the footage is not too oversharpened in most situations. This is again a benefit of a 12 megapixel sensor, which makes the processing much easier. Of course, it can shoot 4K up to 60p with all three cameras. A huge improvement is the option to shoot PAL 25 and 50p video in the stock app introduced in iOS 14.3. The main wide camera produces the nicest video, of course. It has the biggest sensor and it can capture the highest amount of the real detail, as I've explained in the still section. Ultra-wide video is actually very nice. The processing looks really good considering that it uses a very small sensor. HDR capabilities also help it compete with the best action cameras on the market, but I will make a separate video about that. As you can probably guess, I like the telephoto video the least. There is a lot of sharpening and it generally looks artificial. Much like with stills, it is still better than nothing. One feature that got a lot of attention is the cinema mode. This is basically a portrait mode for video. You can set an object to follow and it will kind of blur the background around it. It kind of works, although I can't really say that I like the results. It also only works in 1080p, which means that I will never use it. There are definitely much better ways to shoot video with iPhone 13 Pro. One of them will be to use Apple ProRes codec, which will be available later on. I'm looking forward to testing it and I will definitely make a video about that once it will be released. The image stabilization is incredibly effective. Unlike the 12 Pro, which has lens stabilization, iPhone 13 Pro uses sensor stabilization. The iPhone has fixed lenses on all three cameras, so unlike on a mirrorless camera, it doesn't really have any practical implications. It is way more than sufficient for panning and holding the camera still on both main and ultra-wide cameras. That is to be expected at this point, so I'm not gonna talk much about that. What I did not expect though is the effectiveness of the image stabilization when walking. That is nothing short of amazing. I would have definitely guessed that this was shot using a gimbal, but I promise that it wasn't. 26mm field of view is pretty difficult to stabilize, but the iPhone does a fantastic job. 13mm ultra-wide focal length is much easier to stabilize, so that looks great as expected. The stabilization on the telephoto camera is also fine. It stabilizes static shots very effectively, and that is basically all that I should ask at 77mm focal length. Regarding the autofocus, there is not much to talk about. On the main camera, it is basically perfect. The focusing is extremely fast, the accuracy is 100%, and there is no hunting even in the low light. That applies to both stills and video. It slows down a little bit on the telephoto lens in the low light, but it is still very good overall. The ultra-wide camera now also uses autofocus. The depth of field on that one is so deep that it works pretty much seamlessly. The main reason for the autofocus are probably the macro capabilities. It can focus at extremely close distance and take these macro shots with an interesting perspective. At this focal length you will get a lot of distortion, so it is not suitable for every subject. The camera app is very similar to the previous iPhones, although there are some new options and settings. I think that it is still intuitive and all of the options are pretty easy to find and understand. I also highly recommend taking a look at the camera section in the settings, because some features such as HDR video or codecs have to be set here. One more thing that affects the iPhone photography a lot is the display. The display has also been significantly improved. It is still a 6.1-inch 460 ppi display, but the refresh rate is now 120 Hz. The difference is visible in some situations. Especially the animations and scrolling is a lot smoother in some apps. The peak brightness in SDR is also increased from 800 nits to 1000 nits. HDR peak brightness is still 1200 nits. Another big change is the smaller notch. It is definitely noticeable, but the software will have to be updated to take an advantage of that. I think that it has a lot of potential, such as showing battery percentage and so on. The display is great overall. It is an excellent OLED panel with great contrast and brightness as well as the colors, so I have nothing to complain about regarding the display. Another feature that indirectly affects the shooting experience is the battery. As I was testing the camera, I managed to take about 250 shots in a day, a couple of video clips. I use the phone normally for other tasks while being connected to 4G network, and I still had more than half battery left. I am very happy with that. To sum up, I am generally very happy with the camera setup on iPhone 13 Pro. First of all, I am super happy that the highest version of the cameras is available in the 6.1-inch iPhone. That main sensor makes the images look more natural, and it really brings the iPhone closer to dedicated cameras of some types. The ultrawide camera has also been greatly improved. ProRAW files are absolutely amazing. Video capabilities also continue to be a major strength of iPhone. Definitely worth mentioning is the stabilization, which is also pretty incredible. Most of the downsides, in my opinion, have to do with the telephoto camera. 77mm focal length is good for portraits, but less versatile otherwise. The f2.8 lens only lets in half of the light, and the resulting image quality is not that great. Despite that, I think that the iPhone 13 Pro is a huge step forward in comparison to the previous 6.1-inch iPhone. That larger camera bump isn't a big deal in my opinion, and I actually think that it looks cool, to be honest. I am generally very happy with the cameras on the iPhone 13 Pro, and if you are looking for a smartphone with the best possible camera performance, I can highly recommend iPhone 13 Pro. So that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. I hope that you liked this video and that you have found it to be useful. Stay tuned for more videos and maybe consider subscribing if you don't want to miss my future content. I appreciate your feedback in form of thumbs up or thumbs down. If you would like to ask anything or share opinion, please do so in the comment section, and see you next time.